There is a crown in the royal cabinet that I never place on the upper shelves. Not because it is especially valuable. The gems are modest. The gold has been repaired more than once. One side of the circlet bears a minute crack where some forgotten emergency required it to be packed in haste with ceremonial cups and a seal case, and then jostled over several miles of very ordinary road by men who had no notion that posterity would later stare at the floor and call it symbolic. Most crowns acquire symbolism the way old stone acquires moss. Time supplies what craftsmen did not intend. No, I keep it low because crowns have a pedagogical vice. Set too high, they invite reverence. Kept at eye level, they encourage inspection. From a distance, such an object whispers the usual mortal nonsense. Majesty, destiny, blood made visible. The old fairy tale that a realm inheres in a single brow, and that order descends from a throne the way rain descends from clouds. Come closer, however, and the lie frays. You begin to notice the weight distribution, the inner band padded for long wear, the fastening points where ornaments may be removed for travel, battle, or mourning, the tiny hooks that once held a veil against dust, a practical crown. Not ugly, mind you. Kingdoms dislike ugly symbols, but practical. Designed for someone expected not merely to appear before subjects, but to sit through councils, ride under weather, hear petitions, survive conspiracies, and continue wearing authority after the poetry had gone out of the day. That, my apprentice, is a better emblem for Cormyr than any romantic painting of a moonlit throne room. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Irillian Cantonine, Baelnorn Law Warden, Keeper of Dynastic Embarrassments, Registrar of institutions that outlived the people clever enough to found them and foolish enough to endanger them, and patient enemy of the notion that monarchy becomes wise merely because a bard has dimmed the candles. This is the Lich's tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. We remain in our second season, Realms Between Ruins, the Long Age of Kingdoms. In our first season, we crossed the greater sweep of Faerûn. Contradictory creation stories, creator races, cataclysms, dragons and giants, the flowering and breaking of the elder elven world, the crown wars, the founding time, dwarven endurance, human empires, Netherill's impossible heights and unforgivable fall, myth Drana's brave gamble, factions that learned how to outlive borders, the god-struck chaos of the time of troubles, the blue wound of the spell plague, and the second sundering's hard-won breathing space. Then this season turned from chronology to inheritance. We asked who moved into the ruins, who built over them, who scavenged them, who denied them, and who mistook second occupation for first birth. We began amid the ashes themselves, refusing the fantasy of empty land. We looked to Jamdath and found an empire of cultivated mind rather than floating spellcraft. We traced the Mulan legacy through Mulhorand and Unther, where the divine became administration. We entered the furnace of the Vilhon Reach, where trade and war learned to share a grammar. We walked south into Kalimshan, where conquest changed rulers more easily than civilization. We watched the Shun Imperium turn habit into empire and leave roads, titles, and appetites behind. We studied Amn and Tether, that unhappy pair of adjacent compromises in which wealth without honor and blood without peace competed to see which could bleed a realm more thoroughly. And last time we went north, before the North became a song about itself. We spoke of harsh weather, hard roads, Delzoun's shadow, Uthgard memory, Sea Raider stock, and the way danger grinds certainty down until only useful habits remain. Tonight, we come to a kingdom many listeners think they already understand. That is always a dangerous beginning. Cormyr is easy to sentimentalize. It has a dragon on the banner, a storied royal line, famous wizards, hard-riding soldiers, purple cloaks, handsome forests, noble houses, court intrigue, and enough sturdy taverns, watchtowers, and roadside legends to make the incautious assume they have found a safe corner of Faerûn, in which romance and governance at last agreed to tolerate one another. Nonsense. Cormyr is not safe because it is romantic. Cormyr is durable because romance was forced over centuries into the service of institutions. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. In every age, there are people who believe a grand declaration counts as structure. They announce systems, unveil banners, commission logos, cut ribbons, and congratulate themselves before the underlying work of maintenance has even begun. History is unkind to such people, quite right too. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. A crown that cannot survive rain, travel, and argument is jewelry. A kingdom that cannot survive bad rulers, ambitious nobles, hungry neighbors, and the daily friction of ordinary use is pageantry. The same principle, as so often happens, applies online. Now then, let us place the circlet aside and ask the better question. What is Cormyr? Not merely where, what? A forest kingdom, yes. A monarchy, yes. A human realm with old ties to elven lands, yes. A power of the heartlands. A state with a long memory. A realm of nobles, farms, soldiers, mages, and law. All true. Yet if one must state the matter precisely, Cormyr is a political compromise that succeeded so thoroughly it became tradition. That is its genius. That is also its danger. Most kingdoms prefer to pretend they are natural. This mountain basin was always ours. This dynasty was always destined. These fields naturally obey this crown. Those families were always noble. Such stories are useful because they spare the living the embarrassment of admitting how contingent their ancestors were. Cormyr, if read honestly, rebukes such simplification. It was made, not merely inherited. It arose from pressure, negotiation, settlement, violence, restraint, and repeated acts of disciplined continuation. Its monarchy endured not because monarchy is inherently noble, but because the crown in Cormyr was compelled to become more than a person. It became a hinge between competing powers that might otherwise have torn the realm apart. The crown had to stand above nobles, yet rely on them. It had to welcome settlement, yet prevent colonizing appetite from becoming suicidal overreach. It had to use magic, yet fear what unregulated magic does to any polity foolish enough to trust sorcerous vanity. It had to arm itself heavily enough to survive, but not so loosely that private armies replaced law. It had to court loyalty from common folk without pretending noble privilege had vanished. It had to learn a lesson many states never do. Endurance is not the absence of crisis. Endurance is the ability to pass through crisis without forfeiting the structure that makes recovery possible. That is what we shall examine tonight. Not a fairy tale of noble kings. A machine of legitimacy built in a dangerous forest and maintained imperfectly by generations of people who understood that if the machine ever stopped being serviced, the wolves outside and the ambitions inside would make very swift educational use of the failure. To understand why Cormyr's institutions matter, one must begin before there was a Cormyr at all, when the land was not empty but improperly categorized. The region, later called the Forest Country, lay under the long shadow of greater neighbors and prior claims. To the north and east stretched human settlements and marshy routes tied to the inner sea world. To the west and northwest loomed the older grandeur of Cormyr, whose elves did not at all share the human habit of assuming that a forest lacked ownership merely because its boundaries were not marked by milestones and tax booths. The woods, streams, game trails, glades, hillocks, old cairns, and quiet hunting grounds of that country already existed inside a moral geography. Humans arriving from elsewhere did not step into blankness. They stepped into someone else's web of meanings, permissions, protections, and angers. This is worth dwelling upon because Cormyr's own later political maturity begins in a lesson many other expanding human realms learned either too late or never at all. Settlement is not just carpentry plus optimism. Settlement is diplomacy conducted badly until someone with better sense intervenes. In the early 1st century, by Dale Reckoning's later accounting, before the stand-in stone itself would name that calendar's year 1, men of the Obaskir stock came westward from Impiltur. They were not yet royal, merely ambitious, displaced, persistent, and alive enough to prefer uncertainty in a new wood over the suffocating dangers of remaining where they were. Ondeth Obaskir, with his household and kin, settled in the Wolf Woods at the future site of Suzail. It is fashionable, in some aggressively simplified retellings, to describe this as bold frontier enterprise. Such phrasing flatters the settler and erases the context. A more faithful account would say this: humans entered an old forest in growing numbers, cut, built, hunted, married, quarreled, and survived, while the elves nearby tried to determine whether containment, accommodation, or slaughter would cost less in the long run. There were killings. Of course there were killings. Frontier memory always tries to tidy its early blood, but bloodstains even a forest if enough generations keep stepping in the same place. One of the decisive figures in this unstable beginning was Beroble Ithar, wizard mediator, and one of those rare men whose true greatness lies not in splendor, but in repeated practical interventions at the exact moment when everyone else has become too proud, too frightened, or too angry to choose a survivable path. He is an instructive figure for Cormyr because he prefigures one of the realm's later strengths: the use of personally formidable but institution-minded servants to keep crown, nobles, settlers, and outsiders from destroying the whole arrangement in pursuit of narrower victories. Beroble served, in effect, as interpreter between incompatible assumptions. He knew the elves, he knew the humans. He understood the forest as land, resource, ward, memory, and political boundary all at once. He helped produce the settlement's first durable bargain with its elven neighbors, and when violence made evident that coexistence would require more than hopeful muttering, he participated in the chain of negotiations that led to an extraordinary decision. The elves, acknowledging that the human presence would not simply vanish, chose not endless retaliation, but structured peace. A crown would be recognized, a realm would be shaped, a human ruler would be given standing enough to restrain his own people and answer for their expansion. In some tellings, that crown was first offered to Ondeth, who refused to found kingship upon recent slaughter. Whether one emphasizes that refusal or not, the moral point remains useful. Cormyr's monarchy begins not as an abstract principle, but as an answer to a practical need for accountable rule in contested country. When Faerûn Lorecast, son of Ondeth and Suzara, became the first king in 26 DR, Cormyr entered history as more than a cluster of risky settlements. Yet even then, it was not a nation in the modern puffed-up sense with which later pamphleteers intoxicate themselves. It was a compact, a program, a framework. The dragon on the crown did not float down from heaven trailing inevitability. It was chosen, adapted, grown into. The same is true of the realm itself. Pause over that founding for a moment and notice what sort of political imagination it required. Not pure conquest. If human settlers had simply cut and expanded without limit, the elves of the wider region might have answered with force, severe enough to make the entire experiment short, educational, and terminal. Not pure elven exclusion either, because the humans were there already in numbers and with the stubborn fertility of any people who believe tomorrow's field can justify today's danger. Not mere local autonomy, for scattered settlements invite piecemeal destruction, noble self-promotion, and endless small wars. What emerged instead was monarchy as a tool of containment and coordination. That is one reason Cormyr's crown matters differently than the crowns of many realms. From the beginning, the king was not merely the brightest noble among other nobles. He was expected to embody a compact between expansion and restraint. The ruler of Cormyr stood, ideally, as the answerable center of a project that otherwise might collapse into mutually disastrous appetites. The very existence of the crown said to settlers, your ambition will be organized, taxed, judged, and, when necessary, denied. It said to nobles yet to come, your lands exist within a realm, not the other way around. It said to elves and later neighbors alike, there is someone to negotiate with, threaten, punish, or trust. It said to the people beneath all this, law has at least one visible head, and that head can, in principle, remember the whole forest when local interests remember only their own fences. This is why Cormyr's monarchy was never at its best when it behaved as decoration. It was at its best when it behaved as architecture. The land itself encouraged this. Cormyr is not a realm held together merely by proclamation. It is bounded, pressured, and invited into coherence by geography. Forests and farms, rivers and marshes, roads threading between settlements that need protection. The Dragonmere and coastal approaches connecting it to wider trade. The Stonelands as a perpetual lesson that wild uplands do not stop being dangerous because a map colors them your shade. The King's Forest not merely as scenery, but as resource, shield, and incubator of threats. Suzail, Marsember, Arabel, and other settlements forming a pattern of court, port, and inland strength, rather than a single swollen urban heart consuming everything else. Geography does not determine culture with the obscene simplicity so beloved by bad historians, but it does establish recurring pressures. In Cormyr's case, those pressures rewarded exactly the sort of regime that could coordinate defense, limit private militarization, regularize relations between nobles and commoners, manage roads, maintain watch posts, and keep magic under supervision. A weaker kingship might have produced a patchwork of petty lords forever bargaining with bandits, monsters, neighboring realms, and one another. A more purely tyrannical kingship might have produced rebellions so frequent that no institution beyond fear could mature. Cormyr, through much labor and some luck, found a middle path difficult enough to command respect. And before some sentimental soul announces that all this proves the superiority of wise kings, let me place a withered finger on the page and stop you there. No, it proves something sterner. It proves that under certain pressures, monarchy can be forced to become useful. Useful is not the same as holy. Useful is not the same as just. Useful is not the same as harmless. But in Faerûn, where the alternatives are often fragmentation, mage dominance, noble predation, priestly monopoly, mercenary rule, or a particularly enthusiastic ruin, usefulness is no small achievement. Cormyr's early generations understood this more keenly than many later admirers. They lived nearer the contingency. They remembered what it meant for a settlement to depend on one winter's stores, one season's planting, one negotiated truce, one patrol that came in time instead of an hour too late. They knew that a crown in such a land was not an ornament for feast days. It was a promise that someone, somewhere, was counting grain, roads, quarrels, lords, monsters, and boundaries in the same ledger. That promise is the beginning of legitimacy, not blood alone. Never blood alone. Legitimacy, however, is one of those words bards polish until it shines, and historians use until it goes dull. Let us restore its edges. In Cormyr, legitimacy meant that enough people of enough different ranks believed the crown was preferable to the alternatives. Not lovable, preferable. The alternatives were numerous and generally tedious in their destructiveness. Noble houses unchecked by royal authority, merchant interests buying law piecemeal until every road toll and market privilege belonged to whichever purse had most recently won an argument. Wizards treating the realm as their laboratory and the peasantry as flammable evidence. Priests asserting that temple hierarchy should overrule civil judgment. Foreign coin purchasing local loyalties. Mercenary captains settling into hereditary lordship behind the convenient fiction of temporary emergency powers. Border settlements striking their own bargains with smugglers, raiders, goblinkin, or worse, because Suzail was too distant, too slow, or too distracted to matter. If you wish to understand why Cormyr endured, understand that the crown spent centuries persuading the realm that these alternatives were worse. This persuasion took many forms. Ceremony, yes. Symbols matter. A banner is not nothing, and uniforms have often prevented more chaos than philosophers care to admit. But pageantry alone would not have sufficed. Cormyr had to institutionalize preference for the crown. Consider first the dynasty. House Obaskir held the dragon throne in an unbroken line so long that later Cormyrians could be forgiven, though not by me, for mistaking continuity for inevitability. There is power in such duration. Each successful succession says to the realm, tomorrow can resemble yesterday closely enough that planting is worthwhile, contracts remain meaningful, and local magnates need not test whether private war might finally pay. dynastic continuity reduces the frequency of one of monarchy's great recurring disasters, namely the moment at which every ambitious cousin, baron, temple, foreign court, and seller of hired swords asks whether the death of one person might allow the entire order to be renegotiated with profitable violence. Yet a long dynasty becomes stabilizing only if it is not a naked family racket. Cormyr managed this by making the royal line serve as more than a blood vessel. The Obaskirs became synonymous with the state not simply through inheritance, but through the repeated performance of public duties. Kings and queens were expected to ride, inspect, judge, hear, command, negotiate, and visibly shoulder danger. Some did so better than others. Some indeed did so rather badly, but the model held. The crown in Cormyr was not supposed to vanish into seclusion while lesser officers bore all the realm's burdens. It had to be seen. A hidden crown in Cormyr would have been a weakening crown. This expectation mattered because the monarchy governed through a nobility that was powerful, proud, frequently exasperating, and absolutely indispensable. Many listeners hear the word feudal and assume a finished diagram. Upward service, downward protection, fixed roles, some pleasing heraldry, a few tournaments, and a peasantry born to trudge where ancestry has assigned it. Such diagrams should be burned for heat in winter. Real feudal arrangements are negotiated messes, full of old rights, local exceptions, ambitious reinterpretations, practical compromises, and the ceaseless work of turning mutual suspicion into something that can survive the harvest. Cormyr's nobility held lands, titles, and influence. Noble houses staffed court offices, commanded men, collected rents, maintained local authority, and expected deference. They also swore allegiance to the crown, owed military service or its equivalent, and existed within a political culture that insisted more consistently than many realms ever managed that noble status did not excuse private sovereignty. A Cormyrian noble was grand, yes. He or she was not supposed to be a king in miniature. That distinction sounds obvious. It is not. Across Faerûn, one may find innumerable realms where nobles use distance, terrain, private wealth, or military necessity to become semi-independent powers, loosely draped in the rhetoric of loyalty. Cormyr resisted that drift through a combination of royal will, legal habit, military centralization, administrative presence, and the quietly radical idea that the realm possessed interests broader than those of any single house. Local lords, appointed by the crown, helped embody this principle. They collected taxes and tithes, dispensed the king's justice, kept the peace, defended farmlands, and served as the monarch's eyes and ears. Note the architecture there. The realm did not rely solely on hereditary magnates interpreting royal intent according to personal convenience. It inserted officers of crown authority into local life. These were not always beloved. Administrative presence rarely is, but they mattered. A realm becomes real when its decisions travel. Otherwise, it is merely a court talking to itself. Beside them stood heralds and clerks, record keepers whose work is insufficiently romantic for most epics, and therefore all the more important. I am perhaps biased, yet history vindicates my profession with tiresome regularity. Where charters are recorded, levies counted, disputes noted, boundaries described, titles confirmed, and obligations written, power acquires memory. Where power lacks memory, every quarrel becomes an opportunity for someone wealthy, armed, or magically impatient to insist that tradition supports whatever he happened to want already. Cormyr, to its credit, learned to right itself. Do not underestimate this. A realm held together only by swords can defend a border. A realm held together by records can survive an argument. The nobility, of course, did not thank the crown for being restrained. Nobles almost never thank anyone for restraint. They call it interference, ancient right violated, innovation, insult, central overreach, or an affront to the dignity of their ancestors, who are always imagined to have enjoyed much broader privileges than the records actually support. Some Cormyrian houses were stalwart servants. Some were opportunists with polished table manners. Some oscillated according to decade, marriage, debt, and the quality of recent harvests. Such variability is normal. What matters is that the monarchy did not yield the principle. Nobles might advise, resist, conspire, or influence. They were not meant to eclipse. This balancing act required more than threats. It required that commoners see the crown as theirs in some meaningful sense. Here Cormyr did something quietly significant. It never settled comfortably into serfdom. Farmers might own land or rent it. Crofters might work another's holding for coin or share. But the people who planted, reaped, mended, drove, carted, milled, forged, brewed, fished, and sold in Cormyr were not generally conceived as chattel tied by nature to an estate. They were subjects and citizens of a kind, expected to obey the law and answer calls of service, but also understood as belonging to the realm directly. This helped produce one of Cormyr's most durable strengths. Common folk could imagine themselves loyal to the crown without first needing permission from a local lord. That matters enormously in crisis. When invasion comes, when monsters cross from the Stonelands, when dragons burn, when nobles quarrel, when agents of foreign powers begin whispering that Suzail has grown weak, a realm survives differently if its farmers think of themselves as abandoned tenants than if they think of themselves as Cormyrians. Cormyr cultivated the latter identity. Not perfectly. No realm manages perfection except those described by liars. Yet the tendency was real. Cormyrian farmers were noted for strong mutual solidarity and willingness to volunteer in crises. Townsfolk, crafters, and merchants participated in a shared political weather shaped by royal law, military reputation, and the expectation that order, however imperfect, should reach them. This is not equality. Let us not lose our senses. Noble privilege persisted, wealth stratified. Court influence could distort justice, but a broader realm identity existed beneath aristocratic rank, and that identity supplied the monarchy with something more valuable than flattery. It supplied reserves of consent. Consent again, not in the high-minded philosophical abstraction beloved by sages who have never tried governing a wet road, but in the practical sense that enough people accepted the crown's role that rebellion remained exceptional rather than seasonal. One sees this even in the social rituals of Cormyr. The annual gathering of noble houses at Suzail, discussions of achievements, summer residences, the ceaseless circulation of petitioners, merchants, officers and servants through the capital, the visible gravity of the royal court as a place where matters were settled or at least delayed with authority. Court life was vain, busy, rumor-soaked, and often ridiculous. Of course it was. Humans congregating near power inevitably become decorative in inverse proportion to their utility. Yet the court also performed essential work. It made the realm legible to itself. Nobles came and were seen. Offices were dispensed. Slights were measured. Feuds cooled or sharpened under observation. Policy became known as more than a local rumor. In a diffuse forest kingdom, visibility is power. So Cormyr made itself visible. Not everywhere, not always, but enough. And because Faerûn is Faerûn, mere visibility would never suffice. A kingdom in these lands must also be able to compel. Compulsion in Cormyr wore purple. The purple dragons are easy to romanticize for obvious reasons. The name is excellent. The banner is memorable. The stories are obliging. One can scarcely throw a drunken ballad in Suzail without hitting a veteran prepared to insist that discipline, courage, and a properly sharpened blade once saved the realm from calamity while everyone else dithered. Many of them will be correct. That is the troublesome thing about institutions built on actual service. They accumulate enough truth to survive exaggeration. Still, let us separate function from legend. The purple dragons were not merely brave soldiers. Plenty of realms have brave soldiers and then collapse in thoroughly educational fashion anyway. What made the purple dragons important was that they embodied the crown's monopoly on serious organized force. They were the standing army of the kingdom, garrisoned, trained, oath-bound, and widely understood as royal soldiers rather than the retainers of whichever noble lord happened to feed them that month. Their reputation for discipline mattered because discipline is political. A soldier who obeys the realm rather than a household can hold a gate for the state. A soldier whose loyalty belongs first to his patron holds it only until a more profitable instruction arrives. This is why Cormyr preferred not to permit large religious armies or independent mercenary concentrations within its borders. Such bodies do not merely add force, they add competing sovereignties. A temple regiment answers finally to faith. A mercenary company answers finally to coin. Both may be useful in a campaign. Both become dangerous if normalized as parallel guardians of public order. Cormyr learned, earlier and more consistently than many neighbors, that a crown which outsources defense eventually outsources authority. The purple dragons therefore served not only at the frontier, but within the daily life of the realm. Garrison towns, roads, border posts, castles, musters, escorts, patrols, searches, and all the dull, necessary, unrewarded labor by which a government demonstrates that its decrees can travel farther than the throne room. It is fashionable among certain wandering heroes to mock such routines as bureaucratic annoyance. Of course they do. Any person whose trade depends on exceptional circumstance tends to resent institutions built to reduce exceptions. Yet without these soldiers, Cormyr would have been little more than a collection of noble houses arguing over improved roads. And here we must note one of Cormyr's subtler strengths. The military identity of the realm was not segregated entirely from the common life of the people. Farmers and townsfolk filled many of the ranks. Militias existed alongside the standing army. Service to crown and country was therefore not an abstraction performed by distant professionals in splendid isolation. It was woven into local memory. A A son might join the Purple Dragons. A cousin might serve in the militia. A local lord might owe men. A veteran might return to a farm or craft with stories, scars, and a reinforced sense that the realm was not merely tax collector, but shield. This matters because legitimacy deepens when defense is socialized. The realm feels more real to those who have stood in its service. Yet even so, a sword alone would not have secured Cormyr. The Forest Kingdom existed in Faerûn, not some sensible lesser world where steel and grain are enough. It required another arm of coercive order, one far more feared, much discussed, occasionally resented, and absolutely indispensable. The War Wizards. Now, there is an institution worthy of closer shelf space. In many realms, the relation between monarchy and magic is unstable in precisely the way one might expect when one group believes authority descends through lineage, ceremony, and law, while another can set a door on fire merely by becoming argumentative. Kings need wizards. Wizards know kings need wizards. This rarely improves anyone's manners. In some places, the result is wizardly capture of the state. In others, paranoid suppression until the cleverest practitioners emigrate and later return in enemy employ. In still others, a series of ad hoc arrangements held together by personal friendship, blackmail, and selective amnesia. Cormyr chose a harder and better path. It institutionalized magical service to the crown. The earliest Council of Mages, called in the 1st century after the realm's founding, when monsters from the King's Forest threatened the young kingdom, represents the beginning of that effort. Under Bairabal Ithar, who became the first royal magician, local wizards were gathered not as independent powers temporarily allied, but as defenders subordinated to the realm's needs. From this matrix emerged the War Wizards, at first scarcely distinguishable from the Council, later more clearly defined as a royal magical arm. Observe the boldness of that idea. Cormyr did not merely hire spellcasters, it sought to turn magic into office. That is an immense civilizational decision. It says that the art, however dangerous, however seductive to ego, however apt to produce private towers and catastrophic self-regard, can be disciplined into continuity through oath, training, hierarchy, and expectation. It also says that the state reserves the right to watch those who can alter reality faster than a tax clerk can sharpen a quill. In blunt terms, if one lives in a world where an annoyed hedge wizard may blight a barn or charm a magistrate, one either regulates magic or allows magic to regulate you. Cormyr chose the former. The war wizards became advisors, battle mages, investigators, ward makers, censors of magical misuse, bodyguards to the crown, and yes, busybodies on a scale impressive even by courtly standards. Their oath makes the ideology plain enough. They serve Cormyr so that peace and order may prevail, so that magic be used and not misused. And when doubt arises, they act to preserve the realm. A chilling oath if one dislikes supervision. A reassuring one if one prefers not to wake to a local thaumaturge having declared himself lord of everyone who can be set alight. The genius of the war wizards lay not merely in combat power. Other realms had battle mages. No, their real significance was political. They reduced the extent to which nobles could monopolize private magical patronage. They allowed the crown to know more, react faster, and strike more precisely than a pre-magical bureaucracy could have managed. They also served as a counterweight inside the realm itself. A noble plotting treason had to worry not only about spies and soldiers, but about scrying, counterspells, secret watchers, warded halls, and the possibility that his own servants had been quietly questioned by a polite mage whose smile never reached the dangerous part of his mind. One understands why they were not universally adored. In fact, one should distrust any account in which they are universally adored. Institutions that make states survive are often too intrusive to be loved cleanly. Cormyr lived with that tension. Indeed, one might say it defined the realm's mature politics. The war wizards were essential because unregulated magic in Faerûn quickly becomes private government. Yet magical oversight carries obvious temptations. If the crown can see too much, know too much, pry too deeply, then order may curdle into permanent suspicion. Cormyr repeatedly wrestled with that dilemma. At times the balance held, at times it did not. That the realm later felt compelled to limit certain practices under the Suzail writ tells you much. A system strong enough to restrain nobles can, if unwatched, become strong enough to menace everyone. This is not a contradiction. It is the price of effective institutions. Take Vangerdahust, perhaps the most famous royal magician in Cormyr's later memory. A formidable mage, administrator, manipulator, and guardian of the throne, he regulated not only the war wizards, but notable practitioners of the art across the kingdom for decades. Men feared him, respected him, resented him, relied on him, and told stories about him in combinations varying according to social class and whether he had recently examined their affairs. He is an excellent case study in Cormyr's operating philosophy. The kingdom's most powerful magical servant was not expected to float above politics in ivory detachment. He was expected to be embedded in them, managing threats, balancing factions, preserving the crown, and ensuring that magical power remained answerable to the realm. Dangerous? Certainly. Necessary. More often than Cormyr's critics like to admit. Remember where this kingdom sat. Forests with monsters, borders under pressure, noble ambitions, merchant influence from Sembia and beyond. Shadowed ruins nearby, dragon-haunted memory. The Stonelands never far from trouble. The Forest Kingdom could not afford the luxury of pretending that magic would behave politely if ignored. So it bound magic into service, sometimes quite literally. Magical cloaks, enchanted rings linking royal family and chosen officers to war wizards who could scry and teleport to threats, academies, internal oversight, self-policing orders among the mages themselves. The institution looked almost paranoid from outside. That is because it had been designed by people with sufficient imagination to know what required fearing. I grant that such arrangements produce abuses. They always do. A government capable of magical monitoring will always find reasons to monitor more than prudence alone strictly demands. Cormyr's later restriction of mind-reaming and curbing of broad war wizard surveillance was no accident. It was an admission written into law that the very tools which made the realm safer could, if left unchecked, hollow the consent on which safety rests. Again, architecture, not romance. A realm survives when its powers are strong enough to matter and limited enough not to devour the trust that makes them usable. Cormyr never achieved that balance perfectly. No living polity does. But it kept returning to the attempt, and that recurrent attempt is part of why the kingdom deserves study. Let us descend one shelf lower, from institutions of sword and spell to the daily weather felt by those living under them. What then did it feel like to live in Cormyr when the system was functioning tolerably well? Not magnificently. That is a courtier's answer, tolerably well. A farmer in upland Cormyr might know the crown less as a face than as rhythms. Tax collection, occasional musters, news of local lordships, the passage of purple dragon patrols, rumours from Suzail that filtered outward through markets, shrines and coaching inns, laws posted at gates, expectations regarding land, rent and service. The knowledge that if monsters troubled a road or raiders harried fields, appeal could in principle travel upward through recognized channels. This last point is more precious than it sounds. In many lands, peasants know only their local power. If that power fails them, they have nowhere intelligible to turn. In Cormyr, even when justice was delayed, misapplied, or bent by rank, people understood that there existed a ladder of authority beyond the immediate manor. That knowledge alters behavior. It creates petition culture, complaint culture, expectation. Expectation is politically explosive. Once common folk believe the state ought to protect roads, judge disputes, and restrain the powerful, they become much harder to govern by mere ancestral sneer. Cormyr, to an unusual degree, accepted that risk. The absence of entrenched serfdom contributed strongly here. Farmers might be poor, often they were. A noble roof does not keep rain from the tenant's boots. Yet they were not in the main chained legally to land as a hereditary condition. Independent ownership existed, renting existed, yield shares existed. Movement, though constrained by practical means and social ties, remained thinkable. Such conditions produce a population less inert than serfdom does, and more invested in the wider rules of the realm. A man who conceives himself as a Cormyrian subject can imagine rights, duties, and reciprocal claims. A man conceived only as someone else's attached labor finds it harder to imagine any realm larger than the estate boundary. Then there were the towns. Suzail most of all, but not Suzail alone. Marsemba with its watery difficulties and mercantile vitality, Arabel as inland hinge and hardy northern face, Evening Star and lesser holdings where local identity met crown expectation. In such settlements, the kingdom's structure became more visible and more complicated. Merchants, crafters, drovers, innkeepers, scribes, priests, harbour hands, caravan masters, laundresses, chandlers, farriers, shipwrights, money changers, and all the innumerable souls who make a realm more than an agricultural abstraction lived among offices, garrisons, guild expectations, noble pretensions, and the ceaseless practical friction of trade. Cormyr prospered in part because it did not despise this middling life. Some polities treat merchants as necessary contamination, useful only when taxed. Others hand them the realm and act surprised when coin begins mistaking itself for conscience. Cormyr trod a more careful path. Commerce mattered, roads mattered, ports mattered, markets mattered. Yet the crown tried with varying success to keep mercantile power from simply becoming a rival sovereignty. The realm welcomed trade, but resisted being purchased wholesale. That distinction will matter even more when next we speak of the Dale lands and Sembia. A Cormyrian townsperson therefore lived inside overlapping disciplines: guild habits, civic pride, noble influence, crown law, military presence, magical scrutiny at a distance, religious life without full temple capture of the state. This did not produce freedom in the modern canting sense. It produced order with supervised breathing room. And yes, sometimes the supervision became absurd enough to invite laughter. Cormyr's laws, when written plain, can sound like the realm is composed equally of sturdy wisdom and an aunt's most specific anxieties. Register at the border garrison, exchange foreign coin, acquire a charter if you are adventuring as a group, peace bond your weapons unless properly exempt, bow to royalty and local nobility, permit search by purple dragons upon request. Do not hunt on private land. Also, do not harm cats. That last provision has provoked more smirking from outlanders than I can measure without insulting arithmetic. Let them smirk. Practical law is often particular because reality is particular. A realm that can write such rules publicly is telling you something about itself. It is organized enough to codify behavior, confident enough to post expectations openly, and mundane enough to care about everyday order rather than only splendid crimes. Notice, too, what those laws imply. Cormyr expects strangers. It monitors entry. It standardizes currency where possible. It distinguishes between lawful groups and free-floating armed bands. It assumes that adventurers, that beloved migratory species of ethically irregular problem solvers, must be recognized, licensed, and therefore made legible. It peace bonds weapons because public order matters more than theatrical self-expression. It gives soldiers search authority because the crown insists the roads and gates belong to the realm. In short, Cormyr governs not merely through emergency decrees, but through routine regulation. Routine regulation is one of civilization's least celebrated miracles. No bard sings of forms properly filed, more's the pity. Half the disasters of Faerûn begin with someone exempting himself from a rule designed by an unglamorous mind better acquainted with consequences. Now, there is a danger here. Too much regulation, too much scrutiny, too many permissions required before a person may gather companions and solve a problem. And the realm risks smothering initiative. Too little, and every armed enthusiast declares himself answerable only to his own virtues, which is generally prelude to theft, mayhem, or a very tiresome memoir. Cormyr's approach to adventurers is particularly revealing because it exposes the kingdom's governing temperament. It does not deny that free agents can be useful. Indeed, it makes room for them. But it insists on charter, context, and traceability. Very Cormyrian. If danger must be delegated, let it at least be documented. This habit helps explain why Cormyr appears, to some listeners, more civilized than many neighboring realms. Yet civilization is not gentleness. It is administered friction. A peasant stopped at a checkpoint feels friction. A merchant exchanging coin feels friction. A noble reminded that he owes troops to the crown feels friction. A mage informed that the war wizards are curious about her studies feels friction of a particularly memorable kind. The question is whether the friction serves a larger durability or merely feeds the vanity of office holders? In Cormyr, the answer varied, but enough of that friction served the realm that people tolerated it more often than they rejected it. Religion forms an important part of this daily weather as well. Cormyr is no theocracy. We have just left Mulhorand and Unther behind us. We know what God-shaped government looks like when it fully saturates state form. Cormyr is something else. Many deities are honored: Chauntea in fields, Timora and Warkeen in commerce and fortune, Tempus in war, Helm in vigilance, Lathander in renewal, Saloon, Sylvanus, Daener, Milil, Ogma, Lyra, even Malar, lurking where forest and blood run close. This plurality is telling. The realm allows rich religious life without letting any one priesthood become the skeleton of the state. Again, balance. Temples matter, but the crown keeps armies, law, and administration from dissolving into sectarian competition. That choice does not make Cormyr secular in the chilly philosopher's sense. This is Faerûn. The gods are real enough to make atheism seem less a conviction than a hobby of the impatient. But it does mean Cormyr's government is not primarily an altar with tax registers. The monarchy uses religion, honors it, consults it, sometimes fears it, yet remains distinct. Which returns us to a point worth hammering until even the thick-skulled can hear it through the shelves. Cormyr's endurance depends on differentiation. The crown is not identical with any noble house, though it descends through one. The army is not identical with noble retainers, though nobles command within it. Magic is not allowed to become a free republic of robes, though wizards hold real power. Temples are not permitted to become the state, though the gods are deeply woven into life. Merchants are useful and prosperous, but not sovereign. Adventurers may act, but under charter if they wish to act as a recognized group. Local lords matter, but heralds, clerks, soldiers, and crown appointees ensure locality is not the only language of government. Differentiate, balance, supervise, and keep no single class of actor from swallowing the whole. That is the Cormyrian art. You may think this sounds tediously moderate. Precisely. Durable orders often do. The thrilling state is usually the one about to become a cautionary folio. Still, moderation alone would not have sufficed. It needed testing. Cormyr's reputation was not built in peace, but in repeated encounters with the unpleasant fact that institutions either survive stress or reveal themselves to have been decorative all along. Let us examine those tests. The first kind of test a young realm faces is external predation. This is the simpler test in one respect. Simpler does not mean kinder. It only means that the enemy is easier to point at. For Cormyr, one of the defining early ordeals came in the centuries when dragons, orc incursions, and the brutal truths of frontier survival converged. Between the 4th and 5th centuries by Dale reckoning, the land suffered devastation at draconic claws, most notoriously from Thauglor, the purple dragon, whose age and depredations left such a mark upon memory that the beast helped shape the very imagery by which the kingdom came to imagine its own ferocity. There is irony there, and Cormyr has always had a taste for such ironies. What threatens a realm may later furnish its proudest emblem. Time is a shameless taxidermist. But before later, heralds made symbolic use of dragonhood Actual dragons burned settlements, shattered assumptions, and demonstrated with their usual pedagogical violence that forests are not charming until security has done years of invisible labor. When villages vanish in flame and claw, the question facing a kingdom is no longer whether monarchy feels elevated. The question is whether signals travel, musters gather, granaries are protected, refugees are absorbed, and rulers can still command after the smoke drifts east. Cormyr survived, scarred, depleted, shaken, but not dissolved. Then came orcs from the Stonelands, raiding and occupying portions of the king's forest until they were finally driven out under King Duar Obaske. Again, the detail matters less as isolated event than as institutional proof. A realm that suffers draconic devastation and then orc occupation, yet restores enough order that nobles do not permanently split into independent holds and common folk do not abandon the crown altogether, is doing something structurally right. Notice what these crises demanded. Not glorious single combat, not merely. They required roads usable under pressure, communication between settlements, obligations enforceable upon lords, a fighting force not wholly dependent on whichever magnate remained alive to answer. Confidence among the people that flight was temporary rather than terminal. Most of all, they required the idea that Cormyr still existed even when parts of it had been laid waste. That last achievement is harder than it sounds. Many young states fail not when defeated in one campaign, but when defeat persuades their people that the common fiction has ended. A village ceases to think of itself as belonging to a wider order and begins instead to think only of who can protect it by next month. That is how realms disaggregate. Cormyr bent, but enough of the broader identity endured that reconstruction remained imaginable. Then came a subtler and more corrosive test. Internal fracture. External enemies often strengthen institutions by clarifying their necessity. Internal conflict does the opposite. It exposes the extent to which a realm's servants truly serve the realm, or merely its current convenience. Civil war is the interview process for political structures. Cormyr's War of the Regency in the 13th century DR is exemplary here. A bloody struggle between the rightful king Raigerd II and the regent Salemba, it revealed how dangerous dynastic interruption can become even in a kingdom otherwise famous for continuity. Battle, plague, divided loyalties, the ordinary ugliness by which one branch of legitimacy tries to make itself the trunk. I do not care how many silken banners poets drape across such stories. Civil war is administrative cannibalism. The state must eat itself to keep the body standing. What interests me in Cormyr's case is not simply that the war occurred, but what it revealed about the realm's strengths and weaknesses. First, even Cormyr's durable institutions could be strained nearly to rupture by conflict inside the dynasty itself. This is a useful corrective to romantic overstatement. A crown may stand above nobles in theory, but if the crown's own succession is contested, every latent grievance in the realm sharpens. Houses calculate, officers hesitate, priests interpret, merchants hedge, foreign eyes brighten. The realm becomes an argument about what the realm is. Second, the crisis demonstrated the danger of overmighty individuals within institutions built to preserve the crown. The schism among the war wizards around this era including the disgrace of those who sided themselves wrongly against the rightful heir, revealed that even disciplined magical servants could become instruments of faction if their own loyalties curdled. This was a deep wound because the war wizards, or earlier forms of them, were supposed to embody service to continuity above transient intrigue. When such an institution fractures, the kingdom receives a terrifying glimpse of how its safeguards might become weapons. And yet Cormyr endured this as well. The line continued, the structure held, not without death and damage, not without diminished prestige in places, not without lessons learned at unacceptable cost, but held. Why? Because by then the monarchy was no longer a family alone. It was interlaced with army, law, land tenure, crown officers, common expectations, and a larger identity called Cormyr. A regent could reach for the throne. He could not reduce the realm to mere household property without meeting resistance not only from rival nobles, but from the very institutions centuries had thickened around the crown. This is what I mean when I say Cormyr forced monarchy into structures strong enough to survive its own rulers. If the crown had remained purely personal, the death, madness, corruption, or overreach of one lineal figure might have sufficed to end the project. Instead, the project had become distributed. Court, army, records, nobles dependent on the realm's continued coherence, common folk accustomed to a broader law, and magical service tied to the throne's continuity rather than any one lord's household. Distribution is resilience. A lesson states rarely like because distribution feels, to those perched highest, suspiciously like limitation. Cormyr kept learning it anyway. Indeed, one could argue that the realm's political culture matured through a cycle repeated across the centuries. First, external threat proved the need for unified institutions. Then prosperity allowed pride, complacency, or faction to accumulate. Then internal strain tested the institution's loyalty. Then reform or harder discipline followed. This is not a uniquely Cormyrian pattern, but the kingdom enacted it with unusual persistence. Observe also the role of memory. Cormyr became a realm deeply conscious of precedent. Earlier dragon devastation, orc occupation, noble treacheries, regencies gone wrong, magical abuses, frontier dangers, and foreign opportunism all fed later caution. Cormyrs that forget their dangers become decadent. Cormyrs that remember them become stern. The kingdom oscillated between those modes. Its better rulers knew how to convert memory into policy rather than nostalgia. This helps explain the realm's suspicion of uncontrolled nobles and overmighty mages. It was not arbitrary authoritarianism alone. It was historical learning, though historical learning in states always arrives mingled with self-interest. Having once seen what ambitious courtiers, private forces, and magical factionalism can do, the crown became less willing to trust noble assurances that of course they meant no harm by retaining a few extra swords, one discreet spellcaster, and certain unregistered revenues. Quite right. If one builds a kingdom in a forest and survives dragons, one earns the right to inspect a baron's excuses with narrowed eyes. The same skeptical habit later distinguished Cormyr from realms that confused noble honor with public safety. Honor is a charming word. It has buried more peasants than plague. A noble may be honorable in the code of his class and still be disastrous to the realm if his pride outruns his judgment. Cormyr's crown, at its best, understood that the kingdom required not merely honorable lords, but governable ones. Governable nobles. There is a phrase to warm a necromantic heart. Yet endurance requires more than checking the highborn. It also requires the capacity to renew legitimacy under rulers whose virtues differ. Here again, Cormyr's history is instructive. Not every Obaskir embodied the same strengths. Some were warriors, some administrators, some symbols of continuity more than engines of policy. The realm's institutions had to convert varied personalities into acceptable governance. This is harder than it sounds. Systems too dependent on charisma die with charismatic rulers. Systems too rigid to absorb human variation become brittle. Cormyr generally managed a middle way. The crown demanded performance, yes, but the surrounding architecture buffered the realm against total collapse when performance was less than transcendent. Which brings us to one of the most celebrated late tests of the Forest Kingdom, and one of the clearest proofs that Cormyr's strength lay in crisis survival rather than crisis avoidance. The Age of Azûn IV. Azûn IV is precisely the sort of ruler who tempts lesser historians into lazy monarchy worship. He was vigorous, martial, charismatic, visible, capable of inspiring commoners and courtiers alike, and associated with campaigns whose scale allowed later writers to drape him in all the usual fabrics of kingly greatness. He fought, he rode, he led. He generated the kind of memory that encourages subjects to forget how much unseen structure must stand behind a king before his gallantry can become public safety rather than theatrical self-endangerment. Let us, therefore, honor him correctly. Azûn IV mattered not because he made institutions unnecessary, but because he used institutions well and, when the time came, died in a way that tested whether they could continue without him. Consider first the Tuigan crisis of 1360 DR. The Great Horde from the east represented more than another border war. It was a continental threat requiring coalition politics, logistics, diplomacy, and a willingness to think beyond narrow territorial self-interest. Azûn's decision to respond was not merely brave, it was civilizational. He recognized that a king who imagines duty ends at his own hedgerows is merely a landlord with jewelry. Cormyr's participation in resisting the Tuigan reflected the realm's maturity as a heartland's power able to act in the wider balance of Faerûn. But note what made that possible. A professional military. War wizards capable of meaningful deployment. Internal credibility enough that the king could call upon the realm without his own nobles instantly treating absence as invitation. Administrative stability sufficient to support campaign, diplomacy, and provision. In other words, Azûn's greatness was scaffolded. This is not an insult. Greatness always is. If anything, it is a higher compliment. The king did not stand alone astride history like some illuminated icon. He embodied a realm coherent enough to matter at that scale. One may admire the man without forgetting the machine. And then came the Goblin War and the Ghaznith crisis of 1371 DR, that grim convergence of old betrayals, monstrous allies, dragon-led malice, and kingdom-deep peril, which cost Cormyr dearly. Azûn died. Princess Tanalasta died. Large portions of warriors, officials, soldiers, war wizards, and nobility died. It was the sort of blow from which weaker states pass into memoir. Cormyr passed into regency instead. That difference is everything. Alusair Obaskir, the Steel Regent, is one of the most instructive figures in all Cormyrian history, precisely because she demonstrates how a realm may preserve continuity by selecting function over decorous expectation. She was not the courtly fantasy of ideal queenship. She was harder, more martial, more direct, more at ease in raids and saddles than in etiquette. Some among the polite must have found this inconvenient. Good, history is full of realms destroyed by convenience. Alusair held, and she did not hold alone. Queen Dowager Filferil, the surviving court, commanders, war wizards under changing leadership, officers, loyal nobles, and the remaining structure of crown authority all participated in making the Steel Regency more than a heroic anecdote. This is the point I want you to hear under the song. Cormyr, after 1371, did not survive because one exceptional woman simply seized the story with enough force. It survived because the institutions of the realm had been built such that a regency on behalf of an infant heir could still be legible, still command obedience, and still imagine restoration. Many kingdoms cannot do this. The death of a charismatic king often strips the varnish off everything beneath. Suddenly, the soldiers belong to their captains, the captains to their purses, the nobles to their grievances, the merchants to the highest bidder, the priests to prophetic opportunism, the mages to their preferred apocalypse. Cormyr certainly suffered all manner of pressure and intrigue, but the structure did not atomize. The dragon throne still meant something, even with a child upon it in law and a regent in practice. That is institutional strength. This is also where one sees the role of royal women in Cormyr with particular clarity. The public imagination of monarchy too often narrows itself to kings and battles, as though queens, princesses, dowagers, regents, and court architects were merely embroidered witnesses. In fact, dynastic continuity is often maintained in the spaces between battles: alliances, council, perception, succession management, court equilibrium, symbolic steadiness under shock. Filferil and Alusair, in very different modes, exemplify how Cormyr survived, not simply through sword stroke, but through the management of legitimacy after trauma. If you wish to understand why Cormyr lasts, study its women as seriously as its kings. Study also its willingness to adapt forms without denying core continuity. The creation of ranks such as the High Knights in the later period, the ongoing reform of royal protection, and the changing relationship between court, military, and magical service all indicate a realm that did not mistake antiquity for immobility. Institutions were modified, duties refined, security tightened, surveillance debated, rights reconsidered. The monarchy remained monarchy, but the apparatus around it learned. Learning is what separates enduring tradition from mummification. The war wizards again provide a valuable example. Their earlier history contained schisms, disgraces, and overreach. Under later royal magician leadership, they became famous as both military asset and political instrument, so much so that some Cormyrians and many foreigners regarded them as meddlers whose noses sought entry into every private matter under the sun. There is justice in that complaint, yet even the complaint testifies to how central they had become to the realm's functioning. People rarely resent institutions that do not touch anything important. What mattered in the late 14th and 15th centuries was not whether the war wizards were pure. No serious adult expects purity from intelligence services staffed by human wizards. What mattered was whether they served the crown's continuity more than they served private agendas, and whether the realm could eventually curb them where their methods endangered broader consent. Here, the Suzail writ becomes vital. King Azaun V's reforms in the mid-15th century, which limited noble power and guaranteed certain commoner rights, including trial by jury, are often mentioned only in passing, which is a pity. The writ is one of the clearest proofs that Cormyr's monarchy, though hereditary, was capable of self-limitation in law. Even more telling, the period saw restrictions upon some of the more intrusive magical monitoring historically practiced by war wizards. That a crown supported by such a formidable magical apparatus would accept legal curbs says much. Not enough to make one naive, but enough to deserve respect. Why do these reforms matter for our thesis tonight? Because they show restraint as technology. There, I have said it plain. Restraint is not softness, it is a state technique. Cormyr lasted because it learned when not to permit its strongest servants, proudest nobles, or most convenient precedents to consume the wider legitimacy on which the whole realm depended. Limit the nobility. Grant commoners enforceable rights. Curb magical intrusion. Preserve the crown by refusing to let the crown's instruments become intolerable. This is harder than conquest. Any fool with enough soldiers may conquer. It takes actual political intelligence to know when victory in one contest would destroy the order whose continuation matters more. Azaun V, inheriting a kingdom damaged by prior wars and wider upheavals, governed in an age when Cormyr also had to think about Sembian influence, Netherese threat, and the altered political weather after the Spell Plague and Second Sundering. The fact that the realm did not simply retrench into noble panic or magical authoritarianism, but continued reforming law tells you that the Cormyrian system still possessed elasticity. Elasticity is another form of strength bad storytellers despise. They prefer steel, but steel that cannot bend breaks. Cormyr bent repeatedly and remained Cormyr. Now, before I sound unduly approving, let us insert the necessary blade. Cormyr's institutions did not eliminate injustice. Nobility remained powerful. Court favoritism mattered. Surveillance could grow invasive. The war wizards could become frightening in exactly the manner one might expect from a body of state mages devoted to peace and order. Rural folk still bore burdens heavier than the poetry. Adventurers found themselves entangled in paperwork, permissions, and royal suspicion. Some of the realm's very virtues could harden into complacency, insularity, or paternalism. A monarchy that believes itself guardian of the common good may become dangerously convinced that its own instincts define that good completely. This is the shadow side of disciplined monarchy. A romantic king may ruin a realm by negligence. A competent crown may wrong a realm by overconfidence. Cormyr flirted with both dangers at various times, yet it kept producing corrections, sometimes by reform, sometimes by painful crisis, sometimes by the emergence of rulers and councillors capable of reading the whole system rather than merely their own appetite. That recurrent corrective habit is why I judge the kingdom so highly by Faerûn's standards, which, I remind you, are not generous standards. The average polity of our world would sell its second-best ancestral sword for Cormyr's level of functional continuity. And perhaps its best sword too, if the debt came due on a wet season. More importantly, for this season's purposes, Cormyr shows what inheritance looks like when ruin is not only material. Recall the season's governing question: who inherits the ruins? In some realms, the ruin is obvious: a shattered city, a drowned coast, a dragon cemetery, an abandoned imperial road half swallowed by roots. In Cormyr, the inheritance is subtler. The kingdom inherits contested forest, old elven claims, frontier violence, the memory of how settlements can become massacres if not politically organized, the perpetual danger of nearby wilderness, and the broader Faerûnian truth that every advance in order occurs atop prior uncertainty. It does not inherit a single famous fallen empire so much as a pattern of unresolved pressures. That pattern shapes everything. Cormyr remains alert because it remembers that peace here was built, not given. The forest can always become threatening again. The stonelands can always disgorge trouble. Nobles can always reimagine themselves. Neighbors can always test a border. Wizards can always decide they are unusually qualified to improve the realm by ignoring all procedure. The kingdom's institutions are therefore not ornaments added after civilization arrived. They are the very means by which civilization is continuously reasserted. A Cormyrian road is not merely a path between points. It is a claim that the realm extends this far, that patrols will come, that law has memory, that trade may proceed, that a farm behind the road belongs to something larger than itself. A watchtower is not scenery. A border garrison is not local inconvenience. A peace bond on a sword is not fussy etiquette. Each is an instrument by which the crown teaches the land and the people to believe in continuance, which is also why Cormyr attracts adventurers in such particular ways. Not because it is lawless, quite the reverse. Adventurers matter here because the kingdom is ordered enough to know what it cannot do alone. Charters exist because the crown recognizes that deniable, flexible, mobile problem solvers are useful in cracks between formal structures. Monsters in ruins, smugglers along difficult stretches, noble embarrassments unsuited to public troops, stoneland schemes, investigations requiring initiative beyond ordinary patrol logic. Cormyr does not romanticize freelance violence as freedom. It domesticates it as a supplement. Very Cormyrian indeed. If it must have chaos, it will stamp it, file it, and give it instructions. There is, however, one more ingredient without which the whole Cormyrian arrangement becomes harder to understand: the forest itself. Too many summaries treat the phrase forest kingdom as decorative, a pleasant way of saying there are trees between the castles. But environment shapes governance not by crude determinism, as though conifers issue decrees, but by setting recurring problems to which politics must respond. Cormyr's woods are resource, refuge, barrier, memory, and menace at once. Timber must be cut, yet not so wildly that roads lose shelter, streams misbehave, and bandits learn new geometry. Hunting grounds must be managed. Monsters breed or lair beneath the same canopy that supplies game and firewood. Elven memory lingers in some stands. Druids, foresters, charcoal burners, rangers, poachers, noble hunters, peasants gathering deadfall, and crown officers all look at the same forest and see different lawful uses. A weak state turns such complexity into continual petty conflict. A brutal state solves it by desolation. Cormyr did something more intelligent. It treated the forest as a governed space. That sounds simple. It is not. To govern a forest is to govern movement. Roads must be cut and maintained, not merely blazed. Patrol routes must matter in all seasons. Private hunting cannot become private territorial sovereignty. Wild stretches must remain wild enough to serve the realm's material needs and defensive depth, yet not so wholly abandoned that they become incubators of threats no one notices until farmsteads start burning. The King's Forest, in this sense, is not only a geographical feature. It is a constitutional challenge written in bark and root. Think of what that requires from a monarchy. Not just central will, but information, rangers, wardens, local knowledge, cooperation between crown officers and country folk, patience enough to distinguish poaching from survival, logging from ruinous stripping, druidic eccentricity from active threat, a newly discovered beast track from the sort of repeated pattern that means something ugly is establishing residency. In other words, the realm must learn to see through the trees. Cormyr did, never perfectly. Again, perfection is for liars and embalmed regimes, yet enough to matter. The kingdom's style of rule became deeply territorial in the best sense. It was not content merely to own on parchment. It sought to know, root, supervise, and defend. This is part of why Cormyr feels more coherent than many neighboring realms with equal or greater wealth. It inhabits its own land administratively. Inhabitance is a form of power. Compare this with more feverishly commercial polities where the state primarily exists at ports, toll points, treasury tables, and the residences of those rich enough to influence them. Such places may become wealthy quickly, but the spaces between their profit nodes remain vulnerable to privatization, neglect, or capture by whoever has the least conscience and the most initiative. Cormyr, by contrast, kept insisting that the spaces between mattered. Farms, roads, forest routes, border forts, rural justice, village defense, garrisons, and crown presence in the ordinary landscape. This is not glamorous. It is why the realm survives glamour's collapse. One sees the same ethic in Cormyr's relation to expansion. Many realms once stabilized mistake security for permission to become imperial. They begin swallowing neighbors, projecting force beyond their administrative competence, and converting success at home into fantasies of inevitable dominion elsewhere. Cormyr certainly expanded in its history, absorbing realms such as Esperen and Orva, and laying claim to difficult border regions. But it never quite became the sort of ideology-drunk empire that imagines every map edge to be a personal insult. Why not? Partly because geography discouraged extravagance, partly because the realm remained busy enough surviving its own problems, but chiefly, I think, because Cormyr's political culture was trained by founding conditions towards stewardship of a core, rather than visionary expansion into abstraction. It had been born to make a dangerous land governable. That task never truly ended. There was always another road to secure, another noble to remind, another band of raiders to discourage, another magical problem to document before it became a regional legend. Imperial fantasy has less room to bloom when maintenance keeps knocking at the chamber door. This makes Cormyr seem modest beside louder powers. Excellent. Loud powers are usually about to require footnotes. The kingdom's reputation, therefore, rests on a sort of disciplined middle greatness. Not the flamboyant wonder of Netheril, not the divine saturation of Mulhorand, not the mercantile brazenness of Amn, not the urban cruelty of the Moonsea powers, not the impossible coexistence dream of Mythdrana. Cormyr's greatness is harder to sing because it consists in remaining a state rather than becoming a cautionary extravagance. I have, in long centuries, come to admire this more than most mortal audiences do. The young crave spectacle. The old, if they survive paying attention, learn to value continuity. A kingdom that plants, patrols, records, reforms, restrains, and endures may be less dazzling than a floating city or a god-king empire. It is also less likely to leave behind a crater admired by treasure hunters. This is why Cormyr functions so effectively as a heartland's anchor. Neighboring regions may contrast with it precisely because it is so legible. The Dalelands, which we will visit next, define freedom locally and resist overbearing centralization. Sembia trusts commerce far more than crowns and repeatedly demonstrates what happens when money begins regarding all older loyalties as negotiable instruments. The Moonsea hardens into brutality because its environment and political fragmentation reward it. Cormyr sits among these tensions as a different answer: centralized, lawful, noble-laden, magically supervised, militarily disciplined, and still somehow sufficiently alive to reform. You may object that I keep returning to reform as though it absolves prior wrongs. It does not. It merely indicates that the system still listens to pressure. The Suzail writ, limiting noble overreach and granting commoners rights such as trial by jury, did not erase the inequalities that made such reform necessary. Restrictions on war wizard surveillance did not mean intrusive magical oversight had never existed. The requirement that adventurers be chartered did not mean power was evenly distributed among those seeking such charters. All these measures reveal tension within the realm. That is precisely why they matter. A polity that can acknowledge tension in law is often healthier than one that hides it under ritual and calls the result harmony. This also returns us to the episode's thesis about restraint as political technology. Cormyr's rulers, at their best, understood that not every available instrument should be used to its fullest extent simply because it exists. The crown could have leaned even harder on magical espionage, private informants, noble dependence, and fear. It might have gained short-term command and lost long-term trust. Instead, by periodically limiting itself, the monarchy preserved broader allegiance. Self-limitation is one of the rarest and most expensive arts in governance. It requires rulers to distinguish between what they can compel and what the realm can survive being compelled to accept indefinitely. A tyrant never learns this because he mistakes silence for health. A merely weak ruler cannot practice it because he lacks strength enough even to restrain himself credibly. Cormyr, at its best, occupied the narrow, difficult ground between those failures. Of course, not all Cormyrians welcomed this balance equally. Nobles chafed when rights or precedents curtailed their freedom of maneuver. War wizards disliked curbs that treated their zeal as dangerous. Commoners, when reforms came slowly, had every right to suspect that crown mercy often followed only after crown convenience. Merchants preferred looser controls when such looseness profited them. Adventurers alternated between praising Cormyr's reliability and cursing its paperwork. Foreigners admired the roads and complained about the searches. Such frictions are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of an actual polity rather than a painted allegory. A living kingdom is an argument with uniforms. Cormyr argued in purple, black, and the colors of many noble houses against a backdrop of green. If you walk its roads in imagination, what do you hear? The clink of peace-bonded weapons against scabbards, hooves on packed earth, a herald reading aloud at a village post, the muttered resentment of a merchant counting exchanged coin, the tramp of purple dragons through rain, the low conversation of farmers at dusk discussing whether the crown's tax this year is heavy but bearable, or heavy and foolish. The clipped courtesy of a war wizard asking one more question than comfort loves. The laughter of a noble house at table sharpening into strategy after the third cup. The hiss of marsh water around Marsember posts. The long breathing of forest beyond torchlight. 100 small confirmations that the realm is present, sometimes welcome, sometimes not, but present. Presence is perhaps Cormyr's deepest political achievement, not omnipresence. No mortal state manages that for long without becoming either monstrous or incompetent from its own self-overextension, but sufficient presence. Enough that most people, most days, know who rules, what the laws are likely to be, where appeal may travel, which uniforms represent lawful force, and why a challenge on the road might be tedious rather than existential. Do not sneer. In Faerûn, that is near miraculous. So when later ages produce sentimental portraits of noble kings, remember the less flattering, more useful truth. Cormyr endured because the monarchy there learned to be infrastructural. The crown is roads, registries, patrol schedules, magical oversight, limits on private arms, negotiated rights, taxes rendered legible, nobles kept answerable, and commoners given enough stake in continuance to fight for it when crisis comes. Remove those, and the circlet in the cabinet becomes what all crowns are without institutions. Expensive metal awaiting theft. Now, because some of you are sensible and others merely curious, we should examine the nobility more closely. No kingdom so long ruled by an old house can be understood without studying the class that both supports and endangers it. Cormyrian nobles are not identical to one another, and any account that treats them as a single block should be fed to mold. There are houses of old service and houses of newer rise, wealthy and threadbare branches, families whose loyalty is nearly reflexive, and families whose loyalty is a garment worn beautifully in public and altered at night for more practical use. Some maintain estates responsibly, cultivate local respect, pay obligations, marry strategically without descending into absurdity, and remember that noble distinction in Cormyr is supposed to mean service, magnified by privilege. Others become vain, reckless, debted, spiteful, acquisitive, or afflicted by that common aristocratic ailment in which every inconvenience is interpreted as an attack on ancient honor. The realm expects both kinds and is designed, insofar as any realm can be, to survive either. This expectation shapes court culture. Suzail is not merely the capital because the king lives there. It is the pressure chamber in which noble ambition is domesticated through visibility. Houses come to be seen, ranked, flattered, corrected, envied, and occasionally ruined. Reputation becomes a form of currency. Achievement matters, but so do rumor, alliance, marriage, competence in service, military distinction, access to the crown, and the infinitely delicate art of appearing useful without appearing indispensable. No monarch truly loves an indispensable noble. A truly indispensable noble is merely an uncrowned problem in formal attire. Hence the court's endless rituals, audiences, dances, councils, appointments, and seasonal gatherings. Superficially, vanity. Functionally, management. Every noble kept near the court is a noble partially deprived of the full privacy required for provincial sovereignty. Every house measured against others in the crown's sight is reminded that status flows downward as much as upward. Every office distributed by royal pleasure becomes a tether. Even resentment can be productive if it keeps a house competing for favor rather than openly for independence. The cynical among you may say, this sounds manipulative. Of course, it is manipulative. Government without manipulation is a monastery fantasy, and even monasteries manage perceptions more artfully than they admit. The question is not whether Cormyr's court manipulates. It is whether the manipulation preserves a realm broader than private appetite. Usually, by Faerûnian standards, it does. Yet the same court also generates weakness. Proximity to power breeds intrigue. Access becomes fetish. Slights become history. Bastards proliferate. Secrets gather inside chambers like dust beneath seldom moved cabinets. A vigorous king such as Azun IV could inspire fierce loyalty and equal quantities of scandal. A cautious queen could steady the realm while intensifying rivalries among those shut out. A regent might preserve the kingdom and still leave half the nobility muttering that the forms have been strained. All of this is normal. Cormyr's advantage lies not in avoiding scandal, but in preventing scandal from becoming constitutional collapse. You see the pattern by now. Contain, root, differentiate, supervise. Even romance is expected to submit forms. And because nobles remain nobles, the kingdom must continuously remind them that privilege is conditional. Military obligations, service at court, exposure to royal scrutiny, the implicit threat that if a house overreaches, soldiers and war wizards may take a sudden, intimate interest in its accounting. Such reminders are rarely poetic. That is why they work. One of the most revealing features of Cormyr's political culture is that it encourages nobles to think of themselves as guardians of the realm while simultaneously constructing enough oversight to ensure that this guardianship cannot too easily become private domain. It flatters service and distrusts autonomy. An elegant combination when one can sustain it. Common folk notice this balance too, though not always in the terms sages prefer. A farmer may not discourse on constitutional monarchy, but he knows whether the local baron can thrash him without consequence. A cooper in Suzail knows whether royal law or noble whim more often determines the outcome of a dispute. A caravan master knows whether a noble road claim is real or theatrically invented to extort passage. Such knowledge accumulates into political culture from below. The people of Cormyr do not all love their betters. They do, however, possess a historically grounded sense that the crown may sometimes be used against local injustice. That possibility is itself stabilizing. It means the monarchy is not only the apex of privilege, but also, in imagination and sometimes in practice, a check upon lesser predators. Again, not equality. A peasant petitioning upward does not thereby enter a world suddenly free of class. But the very existence of an upward petitionary habit changes how power is conceived. It makes the realm vertical in a way that can aid the weak as well as discipline the proud. This is one reason Cormyr generates such a distinctive sort of adventuring story. Not the sheer lawlessness of a collapsing frontier, not the urban amorality of purely mercantile cities, not the theologically saturated duty of a temple state. Instead, adventure here often begins at the seams of order. A chartered company receives sanction. A noble quietly seeks deniable aid. A local lord requests help against threats too small for campaign armies and too large for village watch. A war wizard nudges free agents toward a problem the crown would rather solve without public panic. A border fort needs irregular talent. A court scandal requires investigation with enough discretion to preserve faces and enough competence to prevent murders. In other words, Cormyr is a kingdom that has learned how to use freelancers without pretending they are saints. An admirably mature view. No wonder so many adventurers either thrive there or chafe magnificently against its paperwork. There is another cultural habit worth noting: Cormyr's relationship to honor. The realm speaks honor fluently, as monarchies with proud armies and old houses often do. Yet its survival has depended on treating honor not as sufficient in itself. Oath matters, service matters, reputation matters, but the state repeatedly insists that honorable feeling must be made answerable to structure. This is why the purple dragons are drilled, not merely inspired. Why war wizards are organized, not merely admired. Why nobles owe concrete duties, not simply elevated sentiment. Why charters exist. Why border registration exists. Why the realm posts laws rather than assuming everyone of good breeding shall intuit them correctly. Cormyr, in this sense, is one of the least naive honor cultures in Faerûn. It likes honor. It simply does not trust honor unsupervised. Perhaps that is the most concise way to describe the Forest Kingdom's political wisdom. It does not trust anyone unsupervised for very long, not nobles, not adventurers, not merchants, not mages, not even itself, if later reform is any indication. This prudence can slide toward paternalism, certainly. It can produce that maddening tone bureaucracies adopt when they explain that your inconvenience is required for everyone's safety. Sometimes they are right. Sometimes they are preserving not safety, but precedent, and not all precedents deserve survival. Yet I prefer a polity capable of such overreach to one that cannot imagine coordinated responsibility at all. This is perhaps where I should confess a dry affection for Cormyr. Not love. I am too old for simple patriotisms, and I was never its subject. But affection, yes. A scholar who has watched enough kingdoms die develops respect for those that understand maintenance. And make no mistake, Maintenance is the true hero of Cormyrian history. Not dragons slain, not speeches, not coronations. Maintenance. The road repaired before spring caravans drown in mud. The border post manned, the herald dispatched with updated writs, the watch rotations kept, the noble levy counted accurately enough that excuses cannot masquerade as arithmetic. The war wizard who asks one more question and thereby prevents a portal from becoming a public problem. The local lord who actually visits the villages under his care instead of imagining them abstractly from a hall window. The queen who sits through one more council because succession depends on today being ordinary despite yesterday's funeral. The regent who accepts a role she did not desire because the infant heir is more useful alive than avenged. The king who signs reforms limiting powers convenient to the crown because a realm built only on convenience will not endure. Maintenance. It is terribly unromantic, which is why I trust it. A final comparison may help sharpen the picture before we close. Imagine 3 neighboring answers to the problem of order. One answer says, let local communities govern themselves, suspicious of distant crowns, faithful to compact and custom, slow to yield autonomy. That is a path toward the Dale lands. Another says, let wealth organize society, let commerce flow, influenced by efficiency, and policy follow purse where purse proves most energetic. That road runs toward Sembia. Cormyr's answer is different. It says, build a crown strong enough to hold the center, nobles bound enough to serve without eclipsing, soldiers loyal enough to make law travel, mages integrated enough to keep power from escaping into private catastrophe, and commoners invested enough that the whole mechanism does not depend solely upon aristocratic vanity. It is more coercive than the first answer, more principled sometimes than the second, less flexible in some matters, more durable in others. Each answer creates its own virtues and pathologies. Cormyr's virtue is coherence. Cormyr's pathology is overbearing supervision and the perpetual temptation to treat order as proof of moral superiority. Beware any Cormyrian who insists the realm is virtuous merely because it is well administered. Plenty of prisons are tidy. Yet also beware the lazy contrarian who dismisses the kingdom as simple feudal pomp. The fact that Cormyr could preserve a monarchy, restrain great houses, marshal professional soldiers, bind magic to service, reform law, and remain recognizably itself across repeated crises is a remarkable accomplishment in the realms. To deny that is not sophistication. It is ingratitude toward evidence. So when I tell you that Cormyr endures because monarchy there was forced into institutions strong enough to survive its own rulers, I am not offering a slogan. I am offering a reading strategy. Use it, and the kingdom opens. Suddenly, the founding in contested forest ceases to look like quaint origin story and becomes a compact born of dangerous necessity. The Obaskia line ceases to be merely a handsome list of names and becomes a continuity mechanism. The purple dragons cease to be a picturesque military order and become the crown's answer to privatized violence. The war wizards cease to be decorative court sorcerers and become an attempt, partly noble and partly alarming, to keep magic from becoming a rival state. The laws at the gates cease to be fussy curiosities and become evidence that public order is meant to be felt in the body. The Suzail writ ceases to be a footnote and becomes proof that even a hereditary monarchy may, when pressed by history and guided by intelligence, choose legal restraint to preserve deeper legitimacy. And perhaps most importantly, Cormyr ceases to be a backdrop. It becomes an argument. That is what all the best civilizations are. Not piles of stone, nor even habits of power, but arguments carried forward across generations about what must be held together, who is trusted to hold it, and what price may justly be demanded of those who benefit from the holding. Cormyr's answer is not universally admirable. It asks much of obedience. It forgives rank too easily at times. It surveils more than comfort likes. It imagines itself, on its bad days, the sensible adult among wilder neighbors, and therefore entitled to a certain tone of patient superiority. Such tones are common among states that have learned not to fall apart every third decade. They are still irritating. But the realm's best days are genuinely impressive. They show a crown accepting that it exists to maintain a structure, not merely a family. They show soldiers whose service is to the realm rather than a purse. They show wizards bound, however imperfectly, to public continuity. They show nobles reminded that privilege without answerability is only brigandage in velvet. They show common folk given enough place in the kingdom's self-conception that reform can, at least sometimes, move in their direction rather than only against them. They show a polity mature enough to know that roads, records, and limits are often more important than glorious proclamations. There is wisdom in that. Dry wisdom, forest wisdom, the sort that smells of leather, rain, and sealed archives rather than rosewater and applause. And because this is the long age of kingdoms, we must ask what Cormyr teaches the season as a whole. It teaches that inheritance is not only a matter of ruins taken over. Sometimes what one inherits is a problem requiring form. Cormyr inherited contested land, neighboring pressure, forest complexity, and the long realms-wide habit of ambitious people mistaking opportunity for permission. Its answer was to build monarchy into a regulating frame. Not a perfect frame, not an innocent one, but a functioning one. It teaches also that political survival depends on differentiating powers before they fuse into catastrophe. Keep nobles from becoming princes in all but name. Keep mages from becoming an untouchable caste above law. Keep soldiers loyal to the crown rather than to private paymasters. Keep temples honored but not enthroned over all civic life. Keep merchants prosperous but bounded. Keep commoners sufficiently included that they need not greet every crisis with the despairing thought that the realm was never theirs anyway. Do this, and a kingdom may survive dragons, regencies, invasions, magical abuses, court scandal, and the peculiar weather of Faerûn. Fail, and you will leave behind a highly educational ruin for future episodes. We close then where we began, with the crown in the cabinet, at eye level. Not because reverence is forbidden, though I recommend rationing it, but because objects of rule should be inspected for the labor they imply. A crown implies roads, patrols, ledgers, marriages, graves, grain shipments, oaths spoken by tired men in cold courtyards, petitions read by candlelight, reforms argued over by those who fear losing advantage, watchfires in wet weather, wizards instructed then restrained, nobles flattered then reminded. Common folk taxed, then defended if the realm wishes to keep claiming moral adulthood. That is the true weight of kingship. Metal is the easy part. What do you owe a crown that actually works? What does such a crown owe you in return? When does supervision become safety, and when does it become fear wearing a lawful face? How much noble privilege can a kingdom endure before loyalty turns brittle? How much magical oversight can a realm bear before order itself begins to taste like intrusion? And if you were offered a place in such a system, my apprentice, would you prefer the uncertainty of freer lands, or the disciplined burdens of a kingdom that asks more in order to promise more? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions by which neighboring realms will define themselves against Cormyr and against one another. Because next time, we move outward from the Dragon Throne's long shadow into a different political temperament entirely. We go to the Dale Lands and to Sembia, to old compacts, local liberties, standing stones, merchant ambition, and the uneasy border between communities that prefer to govern themselves and powers convinced that trade, coin, and influence ought eventually to govern everything. Cormyr teaches us what disciplined monarchy looks like. The next episode will teach us what happens when local freedom and mercantile hunger become rival answers to the same regional question. One does not truly understand the Heartlands until one has placed these systems side by side. The website, as ever, is live at taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon. History, to my enduring bemusement, continues its migration onto objects one may wear, drink from, or otherwise carry into rooms less dust-laden than these stacks. Still, if a mug or shirt persuades even one inattentive soul to ask what kingdom, ruin, road, or God-shaped disaster made his present possible, I shall count the commerce tolerable. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If you require structures that can survive growth, competing interests, layered authority, unexpected users, recurring revisions, and the inevitable stress test known as reality, choose builders who understand that maintenance is not what happens after the important work. Maintenance is the important work once the public ceremony has ended and people begin depending on what was built. Until then, keep your candles trimmed, your laws examined, your loyalties unsentimental, and your admiration restrained whenever anyone presents monarchy as though it were a poem rather than a system full of hungry mouths, signed orders, uneasy compromises, and roads that still need mending after the coronation feast has gone cold. I am Aurelian Cantonine. This has been the Lich's Tale. And remember, ruin is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting begins when the crown is admired, but the institutions beneath it are ignored, when the banner is praised, but the road patrol omitted, when noble grace is mistaken for public order, and when a kingdom's endurance is attributed to blood alone instead of the long, stern labor by which people forced power to become more useful than beautiful.